those beautiful words. Our final speaker for this program, before we turn to the keynote address of His Holiness, is from Dr. Katrina Lantos Swett. She is a professor at Tufts University and president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice and former chairwoman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Dr. Swett.
Good evening. Like the other distinguished speakers before me who have expressed how honored and delighted they are to be with you tonight, I too would like to say what a privilege it is to be here for this extraordinary celebration. I have had the rare pleasure and opportunity of getting to know the Ahmadi community now for a number of years. And I find that every time I am with them, my spirits are lifted to a higher plane. I know of no other community of faith that I've ever encountered who so fully embody the teachings that they profess, who strive in a profound way every day to live the high ideals and the deep principles that are at the very foundation of their life. And I think those of us in this room know that that spirit, that commitment, of course, comes from God, but it really also flows from your extraordinary leader, His Holiness. And I just feel so lucky, so privileged, so uplifted, and so blessed to be here with all of you today. Now, when my friend Amjad, who is a really fabulous person, and you all should know that he does an extraordinary job on behalf of this community, when he first told me the story of the prayer duel that took place here, or started, I guess we could say, here in Zion, Illinois, I was utterly captivated. It sort of sounded actually like a script from a Hollywood movie. And personally, I hope it does get made into a movie because it's such an incredible story. At first you sort of say, wait, that really happened? That really happened? And one of the things that I found so fascinating about the story was that in a time long before everybody had their little handheld devices and their cell phones and their computers, this prayer duel went viral. It really did become sort of a phenomenon in the world. But what made it much more important and much more significant than any Hollywood script could be is that it really was a moment when two very different visions of God, of humanity, of life, of society were laid bare. One vision, that of John Dowie, was in simple terms based on hate and based on division and based on bigotry and prejudice. The other vision, that of the founder of the Ahmadiyya community, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, was one of respect and reverence, faith and tolerance, and a kind of security that came from someone who was willing to leave the ultimate outcome to God, to Allah. And of course, we know who prevailed in this extraordinary prayer duel. And indeed, this beautiful mosque, which is now being inaugurated this weekend, is in fact called the Fateh Azim Mosque, which means a great victory. Because the victory in that prayer duel went, yes, to the Ahmadis, yes, to the first founder and leader of the Ahmadi community, but really, I think we would have to say that the victory went to humanity as well, because it was a victory for respect, for love, for tolerance, for all of those virtues that we now see embodied in this marvelous community. You know, as I thought about it, a very profound story from the Bible came back to me, and it's the story of Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob who had, because he had special gifts, because he had special visions, because God had favored him, became an object of jealousy from his many brothers. And as probably everyone in this room knows, I know there are a couple of rabbis here, so I hope I more or less get the story right. He was sold into slavery by his brothers. And it was a very dim prospect that awaited him, very grim circumstances. But Joseph was pretty extraordinary. He rose first to be the master of a household of a famous and important and powerful leader in Egypt, Potiphar. But then, through circumstances in which he had done no wrong, he found himself falsely accused and thrown into prison. And so this life of his, seesawing back and forth between being a beloved and maybe even favored son and sold into slavery, then rising to prominence, but falsely accused and again thrown into prison. But through all of this, Joseph never lost his faith. He never lost his bearings. And in time, again, the door opened for him to rise to a position of great and extraordinary power. He interpreted dreams for the Pharaoh that no one else could interpret. All the magicians, all the wise men of Egypt failed, but he prayed to God. He received the understanding of these dreams, and he became truly the most powerful man in Egypt, next to the Pharaoh himself. Well, as you'll recall in the story, after the 7 years of plenty came the 7 years of famine. And Joseph's family, long forgotten back in Canaan, came looking desperate to Egypt for some sustenance because they were dying. Joseph recognized his brothers. They didn't recognize him. But he ultimately, because of where God had put him through all of these extraordinary difficulties, became the means of saving his family. He, very much in the spirit of the Ahmadi community, forgave those who had treated him so ill, saw still in the faces of those who had betrayed him, his brothers, and he said something very, very powerful to them. He said, speaking of their actions in selling him into slavery, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." And I think of that when I see this beautiful mosque now built in the same place, Zion, Illinois, where the prayer duel sort of unfolded before the world. John Dowie meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And the great victory was had by the Ahmadi people. Now we are sitting here tonight in a beautiful setting with wonderful friends in a peaceful place. We will enjoy a delicious meal and share fellowship. But I don't think we can let this evening go by without remembering an Ahmadi community in another part of the world, in Pakistan, that daily faces unimaginable persecution and hatred and violence, who find themselves alone in the face of a government that refuses to protect them, police who refuse to defend them, other religious leaders who whip up their followers to attack them. And in just the last few days, another dear friend, really like a brother within this community, has shared with me the most recent sort of provocations being whipped up against this community, where they are literally being targeted so that the women in this community who are pregnant are being threatened to keep more Ahmadi children from being brought into the world. These are terrible crimes. These are violations of human rights. These are violations of all that is decent and good. But what I think is terribly important is that that community know, above and beyond their Ahmadi brothers and sisters, who of course stand by them, that those of us not of that faith community stand with them as well. You know, I recently read a very powerful book about Great Britain during the Second World War, and during the period of time when most of Europe had fallen to the Nazi military and war machine, which was simply covering all of Europe. And England really stood alone, but knew that it could not stand forever alone against this might. And Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at that time, knew that everything hinged on whether or not America, the country we find ourselves in today, this land of liberty where we do enjoy so many blessings of freedom, whether America would come to its aid or whether they would be left alone to fight this overwhelming force. President Roosevelt, who fully understood the need for the United States to enter this war, but who felt his hands were tied and didn't really have the freedom or the running room to do what he believed America should do at that time, had sent his closest trusted advisor, Harry Hopkins, to England to tour the country, to meet with Churchill, to try and assess, did the British have the determination, the backbone, the wherewithal to continue to withstand this onslaught until somehow or the power and might of the United States could be mustered on their behalf. And Churchill knew how much was at stake, and so he did everything in his power to show Hopkins everything, the devastation that Britain was suffering under the nightly bombing raids, and yet even more than that, the determination and the grit and the steel and the spine of those same people who were trying to ward off the Nazi threat. Finally, it came to the last night before Hopkins would be returning to the United States to make his report to President Roosevelt. And they were gathered for a final dinner, but there was a sort of a tension in the air because they knew how much hung on the report that he would deliver. Hopkins stood up and cleared his throat and said, "I imagine you're all wondering what I will tell President Roosevelt when I return home." And you could hear a pin drop in the room because indeed he had read their minds. That is exactly what they were wondering. And he said, "I will answer you out of the book of books." And then he proceeded to quote from the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. And he said, "Whither thou goest, I will go. Where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people will be my people, and thy God, my God." And then he added the words, "even unto the end." Historians report that Churchill wept because his relief was so great, but also his sense of reassurance that they were not alone. And I would like to say to my Ahmadi brothers and sisters, because really and truly, I feel we are brothers and sisters, that those of us who love and admire your community, who know the goodness of your lives, the decency and the nobility of your teachings, and who also know of the suffering of your brethren in Pakistan, we want to say to you that whither thou goest, we will go, and where thou lodgest, we will lodge. That we will be with you, that we will stand with you, even unto the end. We love you. We are honored to be here for this glorious celebration. And I thank you all for permitting me to be part of it. Thank you.